just wanted to bring up, because it was something that at the time concerned me, but there was nobody saying anything about it, so I kind of kept it to myself for a while and quietly tried to do some reading on the internet, but it was quite difficult because there was very, very, very little. So I just want to say I don't want any laughing or joking and stuff on this one. This one's serious. So the Lucy Letby case, obviously there's been quite a lot of chat since that New Yorker article came out, which if you're not aware of it, you still can't access it from the UK directly on the New Yorker website, but you can get a copy of it if you Google New Yorker Lucy Letby. It's a really long read. It'll probably take you 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. But I would advise anybody that wants to sort of know about the case to read it, because it is really thorough. And I'm not going to go into all of the baby A, baby B, baby C. I would just like to go through how it was that it came to occur to me that there was something to be concerned about. So when there are trials going on in the UK, the reporting restrictions on them are understandably pretty strict. But nonetheless, what tends to happen is that once the trial is underway, the press will go for the prosecution days, and you'll get lots of breathless reporting on everything that the prosecution is saying. And you get much less on the defence. That's the first thing to say. So it's often the case that if somebody is actually exonerated, for instance, you can get a sort of sense of audience shock from people because there's been no attention paid to what the counter arguments might have been. And however we might feel about it, I think the Alex Salmond thing is a case of that, where actually there was for all what any of us might think about him or anything that happened, there was a robust defence placed, and the press just didn't discuss what that defence was. So the Letby thing, it had been rumbling on in the news on TV of an evening. And
just to check, so as I said, I've not paid any attention to this at all, so I'm completely clueless about the whole thing. So what is the Letby thing?
So basically in 2015 and 2016, there was an apparent spike in deaths in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, where Lucy Letby worked. And it came to pass that she was charged by the police with causing some of those deaths and with attempting to cause other deaths by a variety of means. Injecting babies with air, filling their stomachs with air, overfeeding them, and injecting them. Oh, sorry, not injecting them. Forgive me. Putting insulin into feed bags for preterm neonates that caused them to have crashes. And these are all incredibly specific descriptions of events. And so I had been hearing this rumbling on in the court case in the news. And because there's such specific descriptions of what had occurred, I assumed, like I imagine most people have assumed, that there was incredibly good, solid evidence that these things had occurred. And Sonny was actually cooking dinner one day, and the news was on in the background. And I just caught something about there not being any contemporary evidence of them, that it had all been ascertained by a review later on by somebody.
Usually off the teleprompters, even squinting at it like, huh?
But no, but it was just reported as if that was completely okay, right? Yeah. And I'm like, as you guys know, I'm like total sort of junkie for my podcasts. And I listen to and I read a lot of stuff. I'm very interested in miscarriages of justice in particular, because to me they're always interesting, because I'm dead interested in processes and systems, and I'm always interested in how they go wrong. I always think of it as like a system for doing something is like a treasure map. If you start in the wrong place, even if you follow all the instructions, you'll still end up in the wrong place. And I just remember turning to my husband and going, that sounds that sounds dodgy. And he went, don't talk to me, look it up. And there's basically, yeah, fucking, I'm not interested. Off you go, find your rabbit hole, right? And so I started trying to have a look around, and I found an overview of the case on a news website and ran through it, and sure enough, it turned out that there was not, in fact, any contemporary or forensic evidence that any of these things, and not only that she had done, but that any of them had actually happened, which is incredibly strange. And so, when she was found guilty, I tried talking to some friends about it, and they had the same reaction that I had initially. It was, well, but they said this and they said that, so they must have had. And I'm trying to say to them, yeah, but no, they didn't. They didn't have. What happened was, in a normal year, they would estimate that their unit would have 2 or 3 deaths. And in 2015, they had 8, they say, and in 2016, 7. So it's a jump. And in relative terms, it's a large jump. But in actual numbers, it's not. It's and this is where the problem comes with regards to statistical interpretations, because although it's a huge relative jump,
it could happen.
Actual numbers are well within statistical norms for clusters, because you might have been having 2 or 3 for several years, but actually the norm for your level of unit, how you're operating, ought to have been 5, and you just kind of juice them, if that makes any sense, like flipping coins. You might end up getting 10 heads in a row, but that doesn't mean that you get more heads than tails. So, and what had happened was, I think they'd had 3 within 1 month, and at that point, the consultants on the ward started to fear that that there was something going on. And one of them took a notion that Letby was injuring the babies because she had been on duty for all 3 of these. Now, as it turns out, when she was finally charged, not all of those 3, or maybe even none of those 3, were actually on the charge sheet. So the thing that started them thinking there might be something the matter with it did not end up on the charge sheet. Right? That in itself should be of a concern. But so so the consultants tried to get her taken off the ward. And I think she was sidelined, and there's lots of to and fro in here, and if you want to know the exact times and dates on this, you can. But she fought back against that. She was, by all accounts, this was a career path for her. She was wanting to be, stick with this branch of nursing, and had been interested in it from a very young age, and was going after every qualification that she could get, every competency that she could get. She was going after, and she fought against that, and she got herself reinstated, and she instigated a grievance procedure against them for bullying, because apart from anything else, she'd been told by somebody else that they'd overheard one of these consultants referring to her as the angel of death when he was standing in the lunch line. So she won the grievance, and they were made to apologise to her, and only then did they go to the police. And now their excuse, it's alternative universe. Actually, they smelt something wrong off her emotionally, if you know what I mean. Like they feel uncomfortable, and she is genuinely guilty, and she might be. When we need to acknowledge, she definitely might be, and that they're picking that up, and nobody's listening to them, and they feel like Cassandras. And then she wins a grievance, and they're forced to apologise to her. That's also completely plausible. And at that point, they go to the police. And a police investigation starts. But this is the issue I have with all of it, is that the police are not qualified to make judgments about these, about the nature of these deaths. And so so here's where they've got this expert witness who's called Dowie Evans, a Welsh retired paediatrician who's now making his money on the sort of expert witness scene. Now, of these babies, the vast majority of them had postmortems, and coroners had found in all the cases where there'd been postmortems rational causes of death, ascribed natural causes. In some cases, they'd said this very specifics were unascertained, but nonetheless, it was all basically quite normal. For some of these babies were, preterm, vulnerable. Mothers had health. In one case, I think a mother had an autoimmune condition that means she'd struggle to become pregnant, struggle to keep a pregnancy. There's a high failure rate for those, so there's a high chance of the baby having difficulties. One of the mothers had gestational diabetes and had insulin and stuff like this. So and they start this trawl through everything, and it ends up being that they came out with sort of 33 suspect incidents. She was charged with 22 of them. And this guy, Dowie Evans, takes one look at the folder, and within 10 minutes of reading the first case concludes that he knows more than the coroner, and that this is definitely a murder, not natural causes. So we end up with she's arrested, she's interviewed, and she complies completely with the interview and helps. You will have seen those clips on the news potentially that she's talking to the police. She doesn't do the no comment thing. She sits and talks to them because, as far as she's aware, I think she thinks that if she just explains, maybe they'll believe her, and that's maybe because she's guilty, and that's maybe because she's innocent and she's genuinely trying to help. And we can't know that. We can't know in her mind. At one point, they give her the sturgeon treatment and they dig up her garden. This is before she has been charged, or she still should have had anonymity. Except once they dug up her garden, her name was out. It was obvious which nurse it was that was.
So presumably they were thinking she might have buried, items that she had used in these.
They didn't find anything.
Yes.
So all they did find was that she had a carrier bag, or maybe 2 carrier bags full of bits of paper, some of which contained handover notes, which she shouldn't have taken home, but which she said, well, you just end up with many pockets and you bring stuff out. I mean, and I think any of us can relate.
I'll go to the pharmacy.
Yeah. Stuff ends up, yeah. So, I mean, that's nothing. And then there was this infamous kind of these post-it notes on which she'd. Then these were considered confessions on which she'd written, I am evil, I did this on purpose because I'm not good enough to take care of them. She'd also written on those, I haven't done anything wrong, why me? But nobody talks about that. They just talk about her having, and it's come out just recently that these post-it notes were, she was going through counselling while she was being investigated and all the rest of it. The hospital advised her to get some counselling, and she did do that, and the counsellor had advised her, and as anybody would advise anybody to do, just get it out. Just fucking write down all your mad thoughts, and get it out. You'll feel better for just letting it out. And so that's what these were.
So in theory, what you're saying there is that as part of her therapy, that she's acknowledging that she haven't thought, maybe I don't remember doing it, maybe I have done this, and I wasn't consciously aware of it.
People are thinking of me. They think that I am evil and I've done this and blah blah blah. So, and I mean, you look at them. She's written backwards and forwards and all over them.
This is quite an important thing to focus in on, because obviously, if you go in and you confess to a crime you didn't commit, that you don't then go to jail for that crime. Is a different issue. So, I mean, as you say, the evidence must match with that confession. So unless you have the evidence, that post-it note doesn't actually matter, I don't believe, as a point of law.
But so, and a lot of fuss was made in the press about her having, written this, written the things that suggested she was culpable, but no real mention about
the context of all of it, basically.
Well, yeah, or the 80% of it where she's taught, she's writing them that she's not done anything wrong and that they're out to get her, which is what
I don't think. Would I be correct in saying as well, if you were to go to therapy, the therapist?
No, that it's not privileged. No,
but she wasn't found to be, insane or anything like this. So
she was just
so this was
going for stress. Yeah. The jury verdict was interesting because they didn't find her guilty of everything. They exonerated her on some counts, and I think there was one count of attempted murder that they just could not agree on. And then they found her guilty on some. And almost immediately, the police said that they were going to retry her for the one that the jury couldn't decide on, and that meant the press reporting restrictions came back in straight away. And so it just sort of it went away for a while, and I didn't give it a great deal of thought. I'd done some reading at the time, and I just had this gnawing sense that that I was really uncomfortable with the fact that there was no forensic evidence. So and here it's worth talking about Beverly Allett, because that's the comparison that gets made. Now, Beverly Allett was convicted of poisoning patients, and she had been injecting them with insulin and with potassium. And at the time, it was obvious to everybody on the ward that there was something going on. They had the sudden huge surge in collapses. I think she poisoned 50. Anyway, it was a huge amount very, very quickly. And they found injection sites on the patients. The toxicology screening of the patients produced evidence that there was things in their system. She's also bonkers, right? So the history of Beverly Allett, she is, I've made comment before about, the people who've always got wrist splints on and things like that. But I'm always very, very, I grew up at school. There was a girl like that. And I recognised it as a little red flag early on for people who are, in my mind, really dangerous, because they will do stupid and strange things for attention. And they worry me. So Beverly Allett was one of those. She was always wearing bandages and wrist braces and things like that, but she wouldn't let anybody look at what was going on. She failed her nursing exams because she was ill all the time and always off. But she ended up working in an old people's home, and she was suspected of having smeared excrement on the walls and I think blaming the patients. And then she managed to get a job somehow as a nurse. I don't know if it's perhaps as an auxiliary or something like that, or a trainee, but somehow she managed to get a job as a nurse and was poisoning people. Now, you've got a long history there of somebody behaving strangely in public and attention-seeking behaviour. So I think the technical term is fictitious personality syndrome, but we think of it as Munchausen.
Is it fictitious personality syndrome? This is the thing where people it can also be highly linked to things like hysterical pregnancies, where you can actually make yourself believe that you are deeply unwell,
and so it's
difficult
to understand or to be sure of whether or not somebody like that genuinely believes it. Or, does Donald Trump genuinely believe the strange things he says? I think they become true to him. He doesn't believe them when he says them, but then they have to be true. That sort of things. It's very strange.
I think it's like hypochondria is like you, even if you're so anxious about medical issues that you end up convincing yourself you have it.
Yeah.
But it's like, you don't. But there's something going on there.
Yeah, of course.
I have great sympathy for that. Where that sympathy stops is when Munchausen's becomes Munchausen's by proxy.
Yeah.
Because that's no longer you and your internal life.
Yeah.
And how you're moving through the world. That is then you.
So that's where the comparisons with Letby completely fall down, because there is zero evidence that anybody has provided that there was ever anything like that. She was apparently like a close and loving friend. Her mates at school used to call her Mary Poppins because if you needed a tampon or some ibuprofen or whatever, she'd always got it in a bag, right?
Yeah.
Hey. And I believe a number of the nurses who worked with her there and a number of her friends from school have basically said, unless she tells us she did it, we don't believe it. So that's, I think, important and useful.
So we've basically established so far she doesn't have a motive, and she's seemingly perfectly sane, and actually leaning more towards morally, like overtly morally good.
She has
Is her
history
current
of-
She has no history that seems to be apparent of the kind of personality that you associate with doing this sort of thing, which was part of the horror. She looks so normal, she seems so normal, which has been some of the, as people have come forward to start to express concerns, now that the reporting restrictions are gone, there has been this backlash of, oh, you're only saying that because she's white and pretty and blonde and stuff like this. It's like, no, it's because actually when you compare this case to other cases, she has nothing in comparison with the likes of somebody like Allett or Shipman, and she has everything in comparison with somebody like Lucy Letby, who was a Dutch nurse who was prosecuted on very similar grounds at the time for a whole. So I always think when you've got a mirror or something, it was the same thing. There were a run of deaths when she tended to be on shift, and she was prosecuted, and their statistics played very heavily. So you have cases in the UK of like Sally Clark. This is one where she had 2 cot deaths, and there was a doctor called Roy Meadows, who seems to have been an awful man, who came out with this bullshit statistic that it was, some ridiculous billions to 1 chance that you'd lose 2 children from cot death. When actually, if there's a genetic predisposition towards it, if you've had 1 child die of cot death, you're more likely to have a second child die of cot death. But that's not what the jury heard, and so the jury put her in prison. It took three years to get her out of jail, and then poor woman, she had alcoholism and she died of alcohol poisoning about 4 years later. Completely ruined her life, as you can imagine.
There's a real fucking problem with it, like expert witnesses in general. And
well, this is the issue. And so at Lucy Letby's trial, the defence did not put up any counteracting scientific witnesses at all. And we now have a thing called the Thirlwell inquiry going on, which is an inquiry into how Lucy Letby got away with it for so long. But there's been a number of people now coming forward expressing concerns. And that's, you've got Private Eye on the case. Bless him, David Davis MP is as much of an idiot as he can be. He's somebody that has taken up any number of sort of miscarriage of justice cases. So he's one of those people who's just like, he's very easy to dunk on. But you know what? He's quite courageous in his own way. He'll take something unpopular if he thinks it's the right thing to do. So, fair play, credit where it's due. But statisticians have started coming forward in droves. And this is one of the things that's driven me absolutely bonkers about this, is because the counter argument to this has been that, well, we didn't make a statistical case. It wasn't a statistical case. And it's like, right, the fact that you don't understand that you made a statistical case and didn't get a statistician to check what you were doing doesn't mean you get away with like ignoring criticism from statisticians now who are telling you that you fucked up because you have fucked up. So the statisticians are coming forward saying, right, so there was this chart produced that said, oh, let's see, we're charging her with these, say, 20, however many things, and she's present on shift for all of them. Well, of course she is, because you wouldn't be charging her for them if she wasn't. Yeah, right. So let's see that chart redone with all of the incidents, not just the ones that you've decided to charge her with, and let's see who else is there. It's subsequently come out that the first version of this spreadsheet also had doctors on it, and that there was a doctor who was present for a high number of them as well. But by the time it went forward, the doctors had been taken off, and it was only the nurses. Answer me that.
But just to be sure I've understood this, but we're sort of also starting from what could just be a false premise altogether, on the basis that there is...
You're working backwards.
Yeah,
exactly. So you've assumed that a crime has occurred, and you're trying to almost create evidence to fit the crime, as opposed to actually... It's completely plausible these were natural deaths.
Yes.
And actually all the physical evidence points to that being the case.
The post-mortems pointed to that.
That's what I mean, yeah.
And the coroners were not called to give evidence in defence to say why it was that they hadn't picked up these apparent murders. Dowie Evans is not a coroner. So if you want to hear a sort of some quite good science on the subject, Tortoise podcast, Slow News Podcasters, does an episode where they've gone into this, and they So one of the children had liver damage, and the coroner had said that this was, I believe, that this happens in about 3% of cases where I think they're resuscitated. And that was the cause of it. Dowie Evans disagreed with that and said that the baby had been physically punched. And somebody else concurred with that for them to go to court with that. Tortoise podcast consulted with something. They didn't tell them anything. They didn't tell them what it was they were doing or what it was that they were looking at, what the case was, anything. They just said, we've got expert one says this, expert two says that. What do you think? And there's somebody very, very senior coroner, and they came back and said, no, it's one. That's natural. This happens. So that evidence is nonsense. No.
So you would be, I was going to ask, but what was your allegation is it's a punch.
Yeah.
And we're saying it wouldn't fix. I was thinking in my head there that, well, if there is no evidence, this person would have to have killed these babies in such a manner where it was like untraceable, which is like, the skill that would have to be involved in that. But they're saying actually it would just be as simple as she just hit them.
Yeah.
Which seems, okay, so we may have to go into some of the details in this, because I was saying a bit that when you mentioned earlier about the other case about, injecting poison, there's more of an attempt to sort of do the crime, but not lead to actually just go in and hit the baby seems a bit...
It's also like a consistent method. Poisonous versus physical violence are very different.
Yeah, and so there's all these, and then...
I just went without... I know you just said you don't want to go into all the details of it, but how did they allege that she committed some of these? We don't have to go through all of them, but just some of the... Right. And no pumps, so no, again, unlike the previous, no marks.
No. Pushing air into their stomachs. Now, this is one of the ones that subsequent to the trial and pressure restrictions ending, a lot of doctors have come forward and said this thing of pushing air into the stomach is just absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these babies are on CPAP. They're getting air pushed into the stomach all the time. It's just this is not a thing. Dowie Evans seems to have made this up. And then putting insulin in the feedbacks. And so the only thing that the Tortoise podcast sort of comes down on thinking is possibly valid is the insulin cases. Although here again, there's absolutely no evidence really that, I don't think he was even on shift when these supposedly insulin-laced feedbacks were given. There is no evidence that there was any insulin in these feedbacks. The feedbacks weren't kept, they weren't tested. This is an entire theory that this is how insulin might have been administered. So I cannot stress that there is no evidence. The only evidence was that when one of the consultants that was accusing her trawled through a whole load of case notes looking for unusual events to see whether or not there was anything else that they could include, basically. And noticed 3 cases where the babies had very high insulin readings. She was charged with 2 of them, but not the 3rd. So first of all, if you've got 3 identical cases, why is she charged with 2 and not the 3rd? Because she wasn't there for the 3rd. Obviously, that's got to be the answer, right? It has to be the answer, doesn't it? So there's that. But then these insulin readings, are certainly on one of them, was so high it would have been high enough to kill an adult. So, but this baby survived. These were ones she was charged with attempted murder. So this seems implausible. So then it's important to understand how insulin is tested for, because insulin is quite difficult to test for in the body. You don't test for insulin itself. You test for insulin antibodies and a chemical called C-peptide. And how you can tell the difference as a screening method between whether or not somebody's had exogenous insulin, which means essentially maybe synthetic insulin that's been injected in or whatever, is that when your body produces insulin, you also produce this chemical called C-peptide. And I don't pretend to understand the chemistry at all, but apparently the C-peptide reading should be 5 to 10 times higher than the insulin, and that would be normal. And if there's low C-peptide ratio to the insulin antibodies, then the suggestion is that person might have received insulin. And that's useful as a screening tool, but it is not conclusive. The reason being you're not actually testing for the insulin, and other things can test as positive for insulin. So, because again, you're reading for antibodies. So actually, sometimes preterm babies whose mums have received a lot of insulin have high levels of insulin antibodies, but no insulin. So what you're meant to do is then take a blood test and send off a mass spectrometry so that you can see whether or not it's insulin or not. But they didn't do that because at the time these babies recovered. And had they had the amounts of insulin that is being alleged, they would have died. So
just to back up slightly on this as well, so do we know, or do you know rather, the sequence of it? Because you're talking about method. So, like, do we know, did the punch happen
I'm not sure.
first? So just if you were going to do this, start with a punch, it's horrible to talk about, but and then, okay, why would you do it with air, succeed, and then stop, and then change? Like, that doesn't sort of flow to me in terms of how you would do that. Whereas, to come back to the poisoning comparison one, obviously that was a method that worked, and I'll do it consistently, and I'll endeavour to get away with it. Whereas this, it seems like a very weird way to change each of the method each time, almost, potentially.
If arriving at a conclusion based on vibes and then working backwards to find anything that you can...
It's 9/11 to the inside job,
circumstantial evidence to support that is like the number one rule of, like, you do not do that in any kind of, like, investigation. Not just criminal investigation, basic fucking, like, you would never do that in your in your daily life if you were trying to get to the bottom of something.
You don't like in your crash investigation, you don't go, well, the pilot did it, and then you just find all the bits that fit with that narrative and discount everything else.
Unless it's MH370.
Oh yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing, you don't start with that. So I'm a bit lost as to, well, what was
exactly. So this is why, and so...
Okay, because we said it already, but I think, to be clear, she could be guilty. But what we're highlighting is there's maybe questions that definitely haven't been asked.
She could be guilty. The babies could have died of natural causes, or there could be somebody who did fucking murder the babies who is. And
your job is to eliminate, to arrive at the actual thing that happened.
So the police and Dowie Evans are all very, very keen to sort of say that they didn't focus on her to begin with, but we know that the consultants had been blaming her, and then the consultants went to the police. So are we meant to believe that the consultants went to the police and didn't tell them who they thought had done it?
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was actually going to say. I mean, assuming that it's, because the evidence to me actually suggests that it was natural deaths, but even if you say there's something a bit dodgy here, I mean, if you were killing these babies, you'd look quite guilty to me if you were pointing at somebody else going, it was them. So immediately you think, well, the person that's made that allegation to you would become a suspect in that, and I don't know if that's actually occurred or not.
Another thing that's used to sort of bolster the case against her is that once she stopped working on the ward, the deaths returned back to the background level. What's also pointed out is that at the same time, pretty much the exact same time, the unit was downgraded and was no longer taking babies that were under 32 weeks old. So, you know yourself, if you're trying to work out what's causing a problem, you change one thing at a time.
Yeah.
If you change two things at once, you can't be sure which of them.
You have a baseline, basically, to establish that, exactly.
This is just another example of the thing that we've said many times before, which is that nobody understands statistics.
Well, this is the problem, and the statisticians are all getting very, very irritated because, as I say, Dowie Evans is saying, this is not a statistical case. The statisticians are just making a hue and cry about nothing, right? Well, look, I'm sorry, but let's have a little analogy here. Let's imagine the police had produced a photograph of a fingerprint and a photograph of a defendant's fingerprint at a trial and said, see how much they look like each other. And the jury had agreed and convicted them. And then fingerprint experts came forward and said, you didn't do that properly. The smudge is there. You only took a small bit from the middle. You didn't actually analyse the full print. That's not valid. And the police said, well, yeah, but we didn't get a forensic fingerprint expert in to do it for us. We just thought it looked alike, so it's not a forensic case, so we're not interested in your opinion. This is where we are. The statisticians are trying to explain to non-statisticians, you've made a fundamental error here in your idea in the beginning that this was, that there was a spike, there was a cluster, and clusters happen. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't something going on in the ward, but at the same time that you had this cluster, you've got the deaths and the attempted murders that you've charged her with. You've also got all the incidents that you didn't charge her with, because we know that Dowie Evans was given 33 and it went down to 22 that they charged with. So you've got 11 that you didn't charge her with. So that's cluster 2. And then at the same time, they actually had a cluster of stillbirths as well. So have you got 3 clusters? Have you got 2? Why have you got 1? And is the issue that this hospital had a couple of years before made redundant their most experienced nurse, who got years in the job because she was on too much money and they thought they could have 2 nurses for the price of 1. So they made her redundant. You had a bacterial colony called Pseudomonas, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in the taps. They were having to take sinks out. You got sewage backing up. So you will have had microfilms of bacteria everywhere. There was sewage backing up into the sinks in a fucking preterm.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
No pun intended. Like,
yeah, and my understanding is this particular one, Pseudomonas, not only has it got like history for causing clusters of deaths in neonatal wards, but it's quite hard to pick up apparently, and I don't understand why. I'd like
initial allegation against her.
A consultant,
right? Okay, so they weren't that super high up. I start thinking about, is this sort of a
consultant doctor, like they are very high.
They're God.
So in terms of if all the issues you've just highlighted there, if you sort of wanted to deflect from all of that, it would maybe make sense to say this is maybe a deliberate act rather than like actually this is kind of my responsibility.
Yeah, so I mean the place was understaffed. So he wouldn't be in charge of the.
Well, that's it. High up. That's what I mean. How much control over those things would the individual have had?
It's probably been some like. You're a doctor who works your job's like saving babies. You're probably not going out of your way to like make shit up or point the blame at somebody. Probably they had good intentions, but they're not fucking investigators. They're not forensic experts. They can say what their hunch is based on.
And the motive for the allegation was,
I believe that I can imagine. You can imagine that with it's. So she was on shift for a lot of these deaths. And you can imagine that if you've had 3 in quick succession to each other and she's been there for all of them, you can imagine that horrible doubt creeping in. And once it's crept in, that's very, very difficult to expel it. And you know yourself. So if you've ever been in a situation where, for instance, as a comparison, someone's cheated on you, for instance, and you find out, and then you retrospectively review a whole load of things that you had observed but not paid attention to, that all of a sudden take on this new complexion.
Yeah.
And you'll be right about some of them. Some of them will be completely innocent, but they'll all have meaning now. And that sense of having given them meaning, you'll never get rid of. So the doctor in question describes it as looking at a magic eye, and once he'd seen it, he couldn't unsee it. But that means that from that point onwards, that was all he could see.
But because something feels true, that's not right.
That's where the job. So to go and make the complaint, whatever he's done, but the job of the police is to avoid that exact thing. You're supposed to come in objectively and say, well, sorry, you are respectfully, you are saying that. Well, however, we now have to corroborate your hunch, which is what he has. It's all just a hunch, a feeling with evidence, and they don't. From what you're telling me, they don't actually seem to have done that at all.
Also, nurses, like I've got friends who are nurses who work full time. They're fucking on shift more than they're off shift.
Yeah.
Like if you've made people like redundant, if you're short staffed, if you've got shit going on, if you've got all these sick babies who are so sick they're dying.
And she was the most senior nurse. I mean, she was only in her 20s, but she was the most senior nurse. She had the most experience, and because she was really career driven, she was getting every experience, every competence she could under her belt. Maybe she worked
here because they were the sickest babies who were most likely to die. She was the most experienced.
This is what all the statisticians say. She lived at the time on a campus, as it were, in the nurse accommodation. She was single. She was saving up for a house, so she was taking every bit of shift going, and she was doing a lot of the night shifts. And I believe I'm correct in this. I think people are more likely to die at night. I think that yes. I think just because kind of metabolically you're sort of at your lowest or something like that.
Usually it's because there are less staff,
so you're more likely to die at the weekend as well in a hospital. Yeah. But so she was doing a lot of the night shifts. She was basically trying to save up money to buy her own house, and so she was doing loads of hours So right there, again, you've got to do not just a was she on shift, you've actually got to do an analysis of what's the chance of the nurse that's doing X amount of hours being on shift for these compared to a nurse that's only doing X amount of hours.
Charge, though, of what is you deliberately killed them. So am I right in saying that the evidence, if we can call that, is the post-it note? Because would you not start with having to go, well, she might just have made mistakes. It could be accidental. Well, yeah, I mean, even if you're willing to say that these deaths are not natural, something's happened here. Well, yeah, like what is the evidence to say deliberate or accidental? You have to identify that, surely.
Well, this is what I'm trying to say. The adversarial criminal justice system that we have in this country is completely ill-equipped for this, because what happened is the prosecution put up their evidence, which is mostly this guy, Dowie Evans, who comes out with what appears to be quite a lot of bollocks, for want of a better description. Some of it just not grounded in any medical science that seems to be known at all. And doctors are now coming out going, what is he talking about? That's just nonsense. That's not a thing. With no corresponding evidence. So there's lots of like circumstantial evidence, like, well, we walked in and we saw this, but none of it is anything that couldn't also be something completely innocent. So and the start of the Thirlwell inquiry, the Lady Thirlwell leading it, sort of came out with basically complaining about people who hadn't sat through the entire trial, thinking that they knew what was going on. But one of the medical experts that had been working for the defence had in fact sat through the entire trial. And he said, well, so am I allowed to speak then? He's written an open letter basically saying, well, I did sit through the entire trial and it is not, these things are nonsense. So what you've got is a case that arose because of a misinterpretation of a statistical abnormality. And as I say again, she wasn't in fact charged with any of the ones that caused that suspicion in the first place, that became this thing. And so what you've got is this kind of house of cards where this case, all these little bits hold itself up, but if you remove any one of them, it all falls over. And you've got this kind of tautological thing of, I mean, the judge told the jury that they didn't have to know how she'd done it to find her guilty. What?
But that's the missing bit. I've been trying to figure out, going like, yeah, but how is that possible? Because the judge ruled
everything's missing. The methods and the motive.
Exactly.
All she had was the opportunity, because she fucking worked there. She was a nurse who looked after sick babies. The sick babies died.
And at the retrial, the jury were told that they could consider the fact that she had been found guilty for all the other ones as contributing factor for that.
As you said at the start, I mean, she could be guilty,
she absolutely
but I need the evidence to show the fact that she is.
It's just fucking sheer coincidence, because none of that is compelling evidence.
And this is where, bless their hearts, annoyed statisticians are coming out of the woodwork in droves, because they're all saying, one statistician produced a chart asking you to pick out which of these 12 hospitals was the Countess of Chester from their 2015 spikes. And said, you can't, because it was number 13. So if we've got 12 other murderesses, So one of the criticisms that's been levelled is that this is all very upsetting to the parents who did sit through the trial and blah, blah, blah. And I've got to say, I've had a miscarriage. So I've got the tiniest window into their pain, and it must be absolutely terrible. But that still does not entitle them to stop everybody else asking questions to make sure that the right thing has occurred. The entire adversarial process is wrong. Her defence barrister, for whatever reason, did not put up.
It's a very, very common argument in any case where there's been a miscarriage of justice and an innocent person is likely in jail. The family awareness, and usually the family, obviously, because it's very emotionally charged. If someone that you love has been murdered, and then you finally got some kind of closure because the murderer was put in prison, and then you've got people going, no, I think actually they're innocent. And of course it's going to provoke a visceral response, but that still doesn't mean that your visceral reaction means that a potentially innocent person gets to just rot in jail.
No, of course not.
It's also that you're removing their point of closure, because if we accept that the death is what it appears to be, these are natural deaths, it's horrible, but that is the closure point of that.
Yeah.
Whereas now you've reopened it again, and now it's still ongoing. There is no closure now, and there may never be that closure for them, because it's the moment for that to happen has now passed.
So obviously any kind of infant death is horribly sad to go through. Something stays with you forever. You'll never get over that. That's horrific. Had the correct thing been done at the time, and the correct people consulted, and had a like sort of level of fucking care and conscientiousness been adopted at the time, these parents would have been able to grieve the potentially natural death.
Yeah, closure is the wrong word, but the point of grief should have been there.
They've been dragged
elongated,
highly publicised court trials with like these details of how their babies were murdered and how they maybe suffered, and then it's coming out like, actually this guy's just fucking looked at some documents, made a bunch of shit up, and some of it doesn't even make sense.
I mean, there's a big fucking difference between your child passed away naturally and a nurse punched it to death with no evidence.
It's horrendous.
This
guy, Darry Evans, seems... I get sorry to get with vibes, but I do actually get really bad vibes off him. He's interviewed in the Tortoise podcast, and he's blithely confident as he says silly things. He says, well, babies are simple things. There's not that much can go wrong with them. And he kind of lists 5 things that babies might go wrong with babies. And I was walking, the covered walkway between SEC and Exhibition Centre. I was walking up that at the time listening. Just like I think anytime you hear anybody give you a simple explanation for a complex problem, you're dealing with a charlatan, or an imbecile or charlatan, or an imbecile charlatan. And he said this so blithely. There's one account on Twitter that keeps posting the same photo of a very old news article from some Welsh newspaper, where he was quoted as saying that he thought they should decriminalise child abuse because the perpetrators often didn't think that they'd done anything wrong. And I've got no idea what the background context of this, but we just think, I feel like I'm surprised that the press aren't talking about that more.
And it was the classic media thing of obviously what's happened here is the press have jumped to the same conclusion that I think everybody else seems to have jumped to, which is she's guilty, and no one's now willing to admit that actually the way we've covered this trial has been really, really bad. We've not done the basic groundwork, which once again, talked about this in the post office episode, that you casually have done a bit more research, seemingly than many actual journalists on this matter. And again, now they're in a situation where, don't back down, double down.
Yeah, the Daily Mail has got a cottage industry and the Letby monster industry. Now, as I say, I want to make absolutely clear that maybe she wasn't charged with some things just because they couldn't get the kind of circumstantial evidence of times and shifts and things like that. Oh, one more thing, sorry, that we do need to talk about is the evidence that the police presented at the first trial regarding door swipe data in the hospital. It turned out that one of the doors, they had it completely the wrong way around. So they had recorded swipe data for this door as meaning that somebody had left the ward when actually it meant that they were entering the ward. And in one case in particular, this means that the same consultant, that Magic Eye consultant, had said, he said he walked in and caught her virtually red-handed doing nothing. So she was standing over a cot, and apparently I think the alarms had just started to go off. Her baby was desaturating. And he walked in and she wasn't doing anything. Now, any number of nurses have kind of come forward in sort of, in comments of the letters and things, and saying, the first thing that happens when the alarm goes off is you stand and watch for a few seconds to see what's happening and look at the baby, look at the patient, see what's occurring. Sometimes it just stops. Sometimes something's loose. So the first thing you do is you do nothing and you look. So he walked in as that process had started potentially, and she was standing watching and observing to see what before she made a decision on what to do. But he walks in, and because he already thinks potentially that she's up to stuff, he walks in when the alarms are going off and she's standing doing nothing. And so he sees that as ill intent as opposed to assessment. That would be one reading of that. But I believe that this incident couldn't have actually happened the way he recounts it at the time that he says that it happened because of the swipe data.
Yeah.
So this data had been used to show that Letby had been left on her own in this room because a nurse had left. But actually, you swipe to get into the room, and then you just press a button to go out, and that could be anybody. So the swipe reveals who goes in, but not necessarily, because it's a door, it's not a turnstile. So you could be letting any number of people in with you, but actually this swipe reveals that nurse was coming on to the ward at that time.
In the job that I do, we have a procedure. Basically, we don't do the hold the door open.
Yeah.
However, I wouldn't see a reason why that couldn't be possible here. So the swipe is to unlock the door, but if other nurses are coming back and forth, Susan,
you're not shutting the door.
You're not shutting the door on them. So I don't even believe that swipe data, no matter which way around it goes, would be reliable data, unless you have CCTV,
which
they didn't, to show who was present. And when you stop and think about that, you fucking should in these places, for Christ's sake, given the nature of what they do, but they don't.
But so there's I think her name is Jane Hutton. And if I've got that wrong, I'm sorry, I think it's Jane Hutton. She's a medical statistician, and she's pulled this stuff to bits for exactly the reasons that you've just said. Firstly, if it's just a swipe card for a door, it shows you who opened the door, but it doesn't tell you who went through with the parents swiping in and out.
You can okay, I've swiped you in there. I've left my card in the canteen.
Yeah, exactly. As long as it's somebody that you know. Exactly. It only tells you who swiped. It doesn't tell you who went in. But the police had this marked down that you swiped to get out. Now, I'm sorry, but we've all been in buildings where you have to use a card or something to get through a turnstile. You just press a button to go out.
It's only for timesheet purposes. The only time it will change is if you're literally registering that. But that tends to be the main door to exit your job,
the building.
not through separate doors inside the building. That's
so
correct.
The police had this mark that this swipe door data meant that she had been left alone, when in actual fact that nurse was coming back on shift. So now what we don't know is if Letby was in the room at all. And if I believe I'm right in this, but this is just gleaned from reading lots of bits and pieces of things. But the nurse who would have been coming in as opposed to going out looked quite a lot like Letby. And there is some consideration that actually the doctor might have walked in on the other young, blonde, 20-something nurse and seen her, and then retrospectively in his memory when he's going through it, it's become Letby because it's this thing when he walked in on a nurse.
It feels really true. Is that
it feels really, really true. Yeah. And this is where you get into problems with how people remember things and stuff like that. So I find this really instructive. My husband thinks that every film he's been to see at the cinema since the very early 90s was with me. Even though we never met until the mid to late 90s, and we weren't a thing until like 1999. And he talks about, he'll say, okay, he'll bring it up all the time. Such and such film, and I go, I've not seen that. Yeah, you have. We went to see it at the cinema. This conversation has happened multiple times. No, we didn't. Yeah, we did. IMDb. That was released in 1993. I was still in Sheffield, and he'll go, but I remember. I'm like,
this is false memory information. So if you've got
conflagration,
so let's say the consultant is being interviewed by the police. If the police pull up the data and they say, according to the card swipe machine, she was in the room. Do you remember seeing her there? So you've already created a false premise. Because you're told that she was there, when of course we now know very likely she wasn't.
But also this, I think at the time had already decided she was guilty, so that's him doing the.
But you're leading him in a direction. So therefore, if he's going like, truthfully, actually, I don't really remember. I thought it was the other one. but the cops now just told me, but the sign-in sheet says otherwise, so therefore he's going to start going, oh, no, it must have been her. And then suddenly you're making a memory. Yeah, that's
so
exactly it.
A memory, and this is what people don't record. Every time you remember something, you re-record it when you put it back. Yeah. Which is why we're all living completely fictitious lives. Yeah. Things that we think have happened haven't. And conflagration is an incredibly common one, where the event that you remember is real.
It's recolored and pictured by
but you'll think it happened on a different day or a different place to where it happened. I mean, again, similarly, my husband will be absolutely convinced that something happened in such and such a place. And I go, well, no, we lived in this house at that time because of blah blah blah, and that happened that, and we've got this contemporary event. And he'll be like, but I'm sure. I know you're sure. You're still wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And it happens all the time. Now, I'm sure the stuff that I've got in my brain that I'm absolutely convinced happened at such and such a time, and I'm just wrong. I'm just wrong. The colour of a car that you saw in an accident, if you've known somebody that's had the same kind of car, you'll tell the police, there's every chance you'll tell the police that it's blue when it's green or something like that, because in your head, Peugeot 205s are blue, right? And your brain is making shortcuts all the time. Your brain is kind of like, do you remember video discs, laser discs, when they first tried to put a film on a disc? And they were
pre-forerunner to DVD. It was before DVDs.
Yeah, they were enormous because they were trying to create every single scene, and it required this enormous disc. And what DVD did was it only recorded the changes, and that was how they were able to make a film fit on something the size of a CD. Your brain's the same. It's taking in loads of stuff all the time, but it's lazy and it doesn't want to have to absorb everything. So it takes shortcuts and it fills things in.
It's also the nature of this one too, because obviously if you witness a murder, that will likely stick with you a bit more. Whereas of course what's happened to you is these are, how many months was this over?
So it was over, like the events happened over 2 years.
2 years.
But so you've got...
So the incident in question there about, did you ever seeing her, this wasn't like, if you
but it would have been 2 or 3 years later.
That's what I mean. It's not like, you just had a big car crash, you're down the police station, you're giving your statement. It's like and as I say, that would strike me by the point of him being asked about that, the swipe data may have become involved. And I think that, that it's probable that, they've accidentally led people to conclusions without, I'm not saying anyone had the intention of doing any of this.
I'm sure.
But that is what, as you say, the justice system should be set up to avoid these scenarios from happening.
So this is
to protect humans from themselves.
Is that in the end, they arrived at a point where they'd got, in my opinion, really quite dodgy and inappropriate expert witness reviewing the case files for them and telling the police kind of sort of what they want to hear, if that makes any sense, that yes, there's a crime here and there's a thing. The police were filming themselves to make a little documentary about themselves solving it, by the way. What? Yeah. Then subsequently at trial, this guy, Dowie Evans, goes up and he gives his evidence, and the defence barrister pulls him to bits on the stand and did a very good job apparently, but then doesn't put up his scientist. And this is where you can imagine this is, you hear barristers, you hear legal people say all the time, you don't have to prove anything. That it's for them to prove it. Well, that's all very well and theoretical, but that's not how it...
trial.
It's a jury trial. That's not how it works. That's not how ordinary people think. All they see is, well, they had a scientist and he said this and the barrister gave him a hard time, but you didn't put up anything to tell me what it might be instead. And so with there's any number of lawyers explaining why, well, it was probably a strategic decision because X, and they thought this, and they're like, I don't care. With hindsight, it was obviously the wrong decision. I mean, the jury should have had an opportunity to listen to a microbiologist explain to them. They did get a plumber in to tell them that the sewage had been backing up, but they didn't get a microbiologist in to explain why that might be bad. They didn't get a statistician to pull the entire thread of this idea and to explain about the clusters and the fact that what we'd have actually been looking at was 2 or 3 clusters as opposed to 1. So the jury went away And even on that, they didn't find her guilty of everything.
It's also the justice side of it, but also the sort of lack of a lessons learned. So if a plane crashes, you do your crash investigation, find out why, to prevent another crash.
Yeah.
Whereas because the evidence of how this has all been analysed is so broken and wrong, you can't really use any of it to improve things. Like, none of this is actually fitted together. Where
So
I would certainly, even if she is guilty of what she's been accused of, I think that the lack of evidence to confirm that makes me doubt what's the jury's verdict it was the right one.
She also got a stand in her own defence at both trials,
which is a bit of a weird thing for the
I find that
so was she encouraged to do that?
I suspect she insisted on it herself, and she was very, very emotionally distraught, apparently.
Yeah, I think at that point that would have been a bit of a mistake, to be honest, given the nature of.
Well, I don't know. I mean, she seems to have been somebody that was very keen on making sure that they followed the proper procedures all the time when they were on the ward, and that might have rubbed some people up the wrong way because she was a bit proper and Mary Poppinsy. And it certainly did her no favours that she put in a grievance against the consultants. But it seems that she was aware of the fact that this unit was failing and having difficulties. And I wonder to what extent just the fact that she made a nuisance of herself by being the person that wasn't willfully blind about the problems marked her out for ill attention. And certainly the consultants were only doing rounds twice a week instead of, as it would have been recommended, twice a day with preterms. With premature babies, they were only going around a couple of times a week.
Consultants and remains
Twice a week. Yeah, I know. So,
where's that at? Is she getting you team of lawyers?
she still has. She still has the same legal team, sort of handling her main stuff, but the application to the Criminal Case Review Commission is being handled by a barrister who has a solid history of pursuing cases like this, like wrongful conviction cases for medical staff. And he's a guy called Mark MacDonald. And I remember when the first trial finished, and I'm still, I'd been reading as much as I could, and I'm thinking, God, I've got a bad feeling about this. I've got a bad feeling about this. And he was the only person that I saw on TV. I think he was on Talk TV or something, and he really had to be firm with some gobshite. And he said she might well be innocent, and he stood his ground up against this guy and explained and talked about Lucy Letby, and I thought, okay, it's not just me. I'm not the only person that sees what's wrong here. And then, as I say, because the police announced immediately that they were going to retry her, the pressure restrictions came in again. But as soon as that trial was over, there was just this flood of statisticians and doctors and nurses and people coming forward going, there's something the matter here. And so it's painful to think of causing hurt to the parents who must have been through so much. But if a crime has been committed here, it's that we allow the healthcare for pregnant women in this country to be so disgraceful. There's a report came out the other day that 3/4 of all the units, all maternity units, are unsafe. Not merely not good enough, unsafe.
Sure.
My experience in the late 90s when I had my son was that it was so fucking dreadful that 4 years later I had my daughter at home.
Really?
I'm not going through that again. It was fucking awful.
Yeah, because that's what it feels like to me. You talk about the air crash investigation analogy. It seems like a lot of other stuff's not been addressed in the manner that it should be.
The adversarial justice system is really problematic for all sorts of things, but it's particularly problematic where you're trying to decide science with debating tricks.
Yeah.
That's not how it should be done. If there are excess deaths in any medical unit, perhaps there should be an automatic panel that's pulled together to go through what might be happening.
I mean, so when the consultant, because I'm thinking if this is, open back up again and you reevaluate it, So he went to the police. Is that correct? He reported
A couple of them went to the police.
Right.
Yeah,
So, that's what on.
certain accusations against them.
But this is but on what grounds though? Did it just basically like, we've got a bad vibe? Here's some stats. Because to me, is well, I don't think that should that be allowed? Like, that doesn't feel like, can he be like an expert high level consultant when he can be that foolish, to misrepresent data like that?
Because this is not their medical knowledge that they've used to just this. It's
Exactly.
She was on shift these times and the witness baby side. If it was Janet that reported it, they probably wouldn't have ashamed it.
Yeah.
But because they're consultant.
But here's the problem. So those consultants should have been, if the police take it on as an investigation, they should be investigating the entire scenario. But instead, two of the people that they should therefore be considering as suspects are actually assisting them with the inquiry.
Yeah, well, I said that earlier on. That's the thing to me, that probably one of the most suspicious things is the fact they're going, it was her. And if you're an investigator, you would probably look at the person that was making the allegation, especially under circumstances such as these. I'm not making any allegations against anybody here. I'm just saying that feels a bit of a blind spot that they've not addressed. And I think that's, regardless of if she's guilty or not, that just sounds like a fucking mess of an investigation.
Yeah.
I'm assuming they're not going to release the documentary showing what they did, because I don't think that will reflect very well.
Pieces of it are kicking about online.
Although it might get picked up for a Netflix redo, assuming it wins.
Field directed.
Yeah, exactly, at some stage.
Kind of guarantee.
If you're interested, there's Private Eye. I've done bits on it. You'll find all of this online. Strongly recommend the New Yorker article. It is a long read. It's very thorough. It's a bit dense, but nonetheless, it is very, very interesting. And the Tortoise episode, that's only an hour. You can listen to that, and that'll go through the various things. They do. I think they might be wrong on their interpretation of the insulin stuff, and they don't talk about the third case. But on everything else, they basically say, well, that's reasonable doubt, that's reasonable doubt, that's reasonable doubt, so this isn't sound.
Yeah.
So it's a good hour. It's a good listen.
Yeah, I'll do some more reading on it, actually, because I'm quite genuinely interested about that. It's one of those ones, though, that although I'm interested, I'm also really annoyed. I can already feel like just talking to you about it, going, for fuck's sake, because you just, it is that. Presumably that's why you go down these rabbit holes, because you're just like, oh, no, that's not that you do that.
It's not the sort of thing that I'm particularly interested in under normal circumstances. It's Daily Mail when it awful fucking fodder, right? I'm not concerned. It was purely that I was standing listening and I heard something and went, what?
I think that's where we were talking about like statisticians and stuff like this. It doesn't strike me as being terribly complicated. Like, a lot of this seems quite common sense, logic, reasoning could be deployed here to sort of come to the conclusion. But basically, where's the evidence? And like some of the stuff we said here, that would strike me as just being obvious, that if you can't, like, these stats aren't reflective of the narrative that you're trying to put forward here. They're in conflict with each other.
But the problem that you have is that once people have accepted a thing as true, then it colours everything else. Well, you're looking at confirmation bias.
Yeah, that's exactly what this is. Basically, the police, I think, have received that from, as we were discussing there, like a high-level consultant. And that must be a very smart man.
So
yeah,
the police will be as vulnerable to kind of white coat syndrome as anybody else is. Yeah. These consultants are telling us that they've got proper... And so it's really interesting. The guy that writes the medical column for Private Eye, Dr. Phil Hammond, he has done a lot of NHS whistleblower stuff. And so when the Lucy Letby case first came out, he thought, good, got her, put her in jail. And I think he wrote something to that effect. Because he thought that the consultants were, doing the honourable thing of being whistleblowers about something that was happening that the NHS was trying to cover up, because that had been his experience previously. And he said he immediately received loads of letters. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't from the usual nutters. Although I will say the usual nutters are out there and you do have to wade through them. But he said it wasn't from the usual nutters. It was from like coroners and paediatricians and statisticians, all saying, yeah, we're a bit worried about this. But none of them wanted to come forward because they were all very, very aware of the fact that it was totally toxic as a subject.
It's also just the way that, going to the police about it. And surely the police, the first response would be, are you sure this hasn't been done accidentally? Like, is she just a bit shit at her job? Like, what? It's just weird how that seems to have immediately turned into she's killed these babies deliberately with no evidence.
Look, I'm sure the investigation went on for months and months and months. And I'm sure that, I'm sure they think that they did do that. I'm just not sure that they did.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly the evidence that you've described to me. I can't see how any of that points with utter assurance towards it being a deliberate act. But also, I don't even think it points to accidental, but to me, you'd have to rule out accidental. You know, that'd be your first port of call. Then basically she's incompetent. And then if you rule her to be competent, then you have to evidence deliberate intent and then, you know, the action of murdering those children. Like, you know, and I don't see any of that from what you said. Again, she could have done it, but I mean, I think that if she succeeded in that, she seems to have committed in some ways terribly the perfect crime, in the way that it's a crime that has been committed with no evidence, with no trace. So she wouldn't say she's not guilty or innocent one way or the other, but I'm just saying that, like, I need that evidence to connect those dots, as not everyone should.
So they trawled exhaustively through a kind of through a computer history, and one of the things that was used against her was actually that she was on Facebook all the time and she was kind of Googling the parents and stuff like that. But she wasn't exclusively Googling the parents of babies that had died. She was Googling, she was looking through Facebook search for loads and loads and loads of people, like all the parents and things that came in. She was just a routine, like, Facebook looker, as it were. And I suspect she's possibly just lonely. I think that's what
you didn't see that till the end, but that's quite interesting.
I find it. It was used as evidence against her that she had looked up these, and I think one of them was that she'd looked them up on the anniversary of the death. But I mean, to me, that's just readable both ways. Either that, and she seems to be someone that's very, very sharp on dates and times and things. I suspect she might actually be a bit on the spectrum, and so to me, that's just, she remembers. And she wonders how they're doing, and she looks.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's two ways to look at that, isn't there? That makes a lot of sense to me, what you just said.
Here's the thing. It's unprofessional. Yeah, it probably is just unprofessional. And yeah, maybe she's this terrible grief vampire. Or maybe she wanted to see if they're okay. She wanted to see how they're getting on, and she remembered and she looked. It's proof of nothing to me. She looked for people on Facebook, other than perhaps that she was lonely and on Facebook too much.
You think it was, like, even, you know, like as a nurse on a ward that deals with sick babies, if a baby in your care dies, you're going to remember that. That should be deeply fucking affecting as a human being.
Well, actually, come back to the stuff we talked about in the beginning. It's not very common. You know, this is what I'm saying. So, like, you know, it would stick with you. It wouldn't be this was happening dozens of times a week. This would be like, you would remember if there was, like, three in a year or something like that.
Yeah, and then it went up to sort of 8 and 7.
But even to say on the 8-7 numbers a year, that's still absolutely comprehensible that you would remember that really bad, you know, 7-8 weeks of that year. That's plausible.
So,
absolutely.
On the anniversary, if that's something that you're struggling with emotionally, it might just be I know the parents are struggling emotionally. I don't have anyone else to really relate to about this. No one else is going through it. They will be. They're also...
Almost to me, that's more of an indicator in some ways, actually, of, again, we still have a road at accidental. So the idea of her thinking, what did I do wrong? Is there more I could have done? Yeah. That sort of actually leads to me slightly more in that direction, as opposed to whatever the evil narrative would have to be like, whoa, ha, 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 yeah, I've killed your kid. And you're like, that doesn't really...
My understanding is that she was,
you know, to me, also
a diligent and competent nurse, and that actually there were always, and this is one of the things, she would get called in to do things. She would get called in on scenes that were happening when she was actually meant to be doing something else, because she would be the only one. You know, there's one of the stories that was in the news was that she would, in a bloody Zumba class or something, or a salsa class or something, I don't know, and she'd come out and discover that there's, you know, however many messages, because the nurses are trying to do something and don't know how to do it, so they're having to bother her on a day off to kind of tell them how to do something. So this is, you know,
I mean, this is like, I'm mapping a lot onto the information. Like, there's a lot of like I'm doing a lot of conjecture that's like I just can't prove. I'm just saying what makes the most sense to me as like a person, how a person would react and like why they would do something.
Yeah.
Evil, like, of course there are people who are just sick evil psychopaths. I don't really know of any cases where somebody, you do get the ones where it's like that, oh, I never saw it coming, there were no red flags. And then information about the person's backstory came out and it's like, it's a fucking parade of red flags, what the fuck are you talking about? It's never just like this perfectly normal person has gone through life, been generally well liked, had this reputation from fucking start to finish. It's hard to fake a reputation throughout high school and college as like a diligent, conscientious person.
Yeah.
And then just suddenly turn around and start killing fucking babies.
I think that I'm going to be honest to say that without getting horrible, because it's a horrible thing to imagine, but the punch I think is just a bit of a standout bit to me because that's violent. It speaks to something that doesn't fit the rest of it. You know, it feels like, so again, if it, did she snap this? Did she hate these? You know, there's a lot of, but the action of that says a lot about the motivation.
The thing to bear in mind is that it was reviewed at the time, a post-mortem at the time concluded that it was an actual, you know, it was something that
it was a punch that made off. Like most likely didn't happen. We should clarify that. Yes.
Dowie Evans thought it was a punch. Somebody else confirmed that it was a punch. But when the tortoise sent it to a completely neutral person who had no idea about it, they went, "No, you know, original decisions."
But if we
correct,
accept the narrative of it is a punch. That creates a, well, who is this person that, you know, that they would commit that action? Why do it in that way? You know, and you go down the sort of profile. I don't want to start profiling the person, but I feel that should be part of the investigation.
It's kind of nonsensical. I mean, you know, when you look at someone like Shipman, people, there are people who do this. But when, as you say, when you go into their background, there's always something. I mean, Harold Shipman had been done for writing dodgy prescriptions for himself because he was addicted to morphine. There was all sorts of criminality there.
Yep.
You just had to look.
Yeah.
I mean, he kept his wife under coercive control. Effectively, the way he treated his wife would be illegal now. Literally, almost barefoot and permanently. Generally, Harold Shipman was an identifiable wrong-un, as it were. Beverly Allen was,
again, from childhood, consistent reputation
pretending that she had injuries and things that she didn't, and so the idea that somebody's kept this veil, there's this kind of mask of complete normalcy all this time.
That's what makes it so delicious to the press. So that's the component that makes it so delicious and so like that. They'll hook onto that, like the seemingly normal, because that's something. Like,
would I be correct? Can I just ask questions with the insulin and the sort of putting you into the stomach? Would I be correct to say that these would be pain-free deaths?
The babies that theoretically received insulin didn't die.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
and that's one of the red flags that's not. I mean, at the time, these results
theoretically she would know this with her own knowledge that maybe that would not be the best way to. If again she was motivated to kill, to guarantee that it would work.
He wasn't even on shift when the food bags were administered that are believed to have given these insulin results. So the idea is that she set these up so that they would go off when she wasn't there, knowing that this would happen. But how could she know when those food bags would get picked? And if she's this grief vampire that's hoovering up the attention, why would she do something that would result in something happening when she wasn't there?
Yeah.
I just, I mean, just even with your own narrative, it doesn't make sense. And generally speaking, I mean, with Harold Shipman as an example again, he was doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over. Beverly Allen was doing the same thing over and over and over. She was injecting people with poisonous things. We've got all these different things.
But they probably had reasons for it. It will be something on the lines, I was trying to help society. There'll be something like that where I was helping those babies by sending them to heaven. The consistency of the method will speak to whatever that motivation is, whereas the inconsistency here is, to me, it's a noticeably violent act which would speak to anger and hatred towards, is it, I want to make the baby suffer, whereas the other work doesn't line up with that. And I feel that that's something that most, with murder, when they investigate that, you have the kind of, the guy just had it was an act of rage, he's flipped out. And then there's this sort of premeditated one, and like you actually have to sort of separate those two as part of the investigation, which again I'm confused about how that doesn't seem to be on the radar with this whatsoever.
I think
because actually none of it makes coherent sense.
Well, this is what I mean exactly, which is where it shouldn't probably have got to the point of going to trial until the police had got it to a state where it could have been tried fairly.
I would argue that there should never be any trial like this happens again. If there's any suspicion that somebody on a ward is harming patients, there needs to be some mechanism by which that can be anonymously reported. I mean, there's the whole NHS trusts and things like that, which are basically run like little companies, and it's all about money and stuff. There's huge arguments we can have about that. But there needs to be some way of reporting that anonymously so that an investigation can be started discreetly, observations can be made, and then a scientific panel can review it. This should never have been decided by people with no scientific knowledge, but that's exactly what happened. We asked a jury of people who have no scientific education. We had the case argued in court by people with no scientific education. So, I mean, it's just not acceptable. So whether she's guilty or not, and I am, I live in a world where either one of these things could be true, but she's not been through a fair process. That trial is just as bizarre. The investigation's flawed, and there's, if I know the parents don't want to know whether or not it's true or not because they think it is, but and I think there will be more will occur with this. I think long term, if she is exonerated, it needs to be used as a starting point for where the hell are we going wrong? Because, even you've only got to look at, I don't know if you're aware of the Andrew Malkinson case, but Andy Malkinson, 17 years for a rape he didn't do. And they had somebody else's DNA on that, and the Criminal Cases Review Commission knocked him back twice. And I think the only reason they took on the third time was because there'd been a podcast demonstrably showing that the evidence against him was bullshit. Right? And I'm sure the families of the people killed in the Birmingham pub bombings and things didn't want it reopened. But the truth is what the truth is.
Yeah. It's always supposed to say that your crash investigation, it's like the trial is the crash. It's like, it's not even like the incident of the children could theoretically, and the evidence actually suggests that this was just natural deaths. So the actual investigation is that how the fuck did we arrive at this? Yeah. And that's the lessons learned that must be done. So I think definitely it has to be reevaluated on all fronts, really. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought this to, I had to know about this. This is all new to me as well. But I mean, that's like, Jesus Christ. But again, to come back to, as ever, the feelings of the media, I mean, like, holy shit. I mean, everything we've just talked about here feels like it should be, front page news. Yeah. And yet isn't.
Well, that's because they fucking got too excited, creamed in their pants, because they had this perfect horror story protagonist of this seemingly sweet, innocent looking, by all accounts, normal woman who was secretly the most evil fucking psychopath you could possibly imagine. Yeah. But not just that, also calculated in like a kind of Hannibal Lecter type way. In the way that like no serial killer who's ever been found to be a serial killer ever has been. Yeah. Because the world isn't actually like that. And
yes.
They got too excited about that, fucking ran with it, and then now if they were to go, actually, this was all this, and to be fair, part of the just about every paper other than the Daily Mail has now, run articles discussing the potential problems and why people are talking about it. I wonder if the Daily Mail will eventually just pretend that. What's really interesting is that thing with the swipe card data came out at the retrial. Because at the retrial, they were having to use some of the same evidence and they were having to mark it. Actually, when we say in, we mean out. Like when we say out, we mean in, right? Mm-hmm. And the jury was having to have this gone through with them continually. And there's one person who runs an account on Twitter, and she sat through the trial, and she was tweeting and putting out information. I suspect she might be a nurse, because there's a lot of nurses going, this could be any of this. Fuck you guys, this could be any of this, right? And nurses can kind of smell the danger, if that makes sense.
Basically, like, right, we see what's going on here, rather than fixing the fucking NHS and sorting out.
We're just going to...
We're going to be scapegoated, for this.
And more conscientious, Sam, at my job. The longer hours I work, the more highly sought after my expertise are, so I'm called in for the most dire cases. The more likely it is that I'm going to get this pinned on me.
Yeah, I get rewarded with a false murder allegation.
The very experienced nurse that they made redundant before all this happened at that hospital has actually said exactly that. I'm glad I was out there. This could so easily have been me. Yeah. This person that's running this Twitter account just putting out stuff, she sat through, I'm assuming it's a she. I might not be a she, but I don't know, it feels like a she. About this stores data, and nobody in the press picked up on it at all. It was ages and ages and ages, and I was trying to find out and understand, and the person running the account was trying the best to explain, but because all it was the police have said this backwards and forwards, somebody, a proper investigative journalist, needs to go through that really, really thoroughly as to what every bit of that data was used to suggest at the first trial, and what it shows and what it doesn't show. But that means getting the transcripts. And David Davis has been quoted £100,000 for the transcripts, because you don't get transcripts generated automatically in the United Kingdom. In America, that's automatic transcripts.
That's fucking stupid.
Yeah.
Who the fuck made that rule?
YouTube videos have automatic transcripts generated. You tell them
this podcast is automatic transcripts generated.
You have to pay. It costs thousands of pounds.
Good God, I didn't know about that. Why though? Yeah.
So that you can't have them would be my cynical response.
Yeah.
God, this country's fucking corrupt. So
it costs thousands of pounds to get transcripts, which means that you're entirely reliant upon what people remember of the trial almost. Isn't that mental?
Fucking hell.
Well, it's really lucky that we've previously established on this episode how perfectly infallible human memory is.
Right, we might pick this up again though. There might be a sequel to this episode by the sounds of it. Yeah.
Sequel.
So,
I hope there's cause for a sequel.
I don't want to cause anybody any pain, and I'm so sorry for the parents whose babies were hurt. But we need to find out the truth. And if the truth is that it was her, fine, she can rot. But if it isn't her, then we need to have a hard look at how we arrived at a position where this could happen.
Even if it is
her, I still think that that's not
about the way that,
because it shouldn't have been conducted in such a fashion that we could arrive at a position where she's in jail for the rest of her life, and there's so much reasonable doubt so obviously on the table.
yeah.